is an MMA fight, dude.
You twist that dick!
Twist his dick!
Twist his dick!
Oh my god.
Oh, dick twist!
허식. 아,掴んだ, 코너掴んだ. 오, 스포츠.
This is アメリカと。
さすがアメリカ人、欧米人。ものが違うとはこのことですね。
逆にディーノ選手に指の関節が決められてますね。
工藤選手もディーノ選手。
That's right, it is time to pop the champagne because the Rivers of Blood, Bloodhound Step, and the Stars of Ruin have all been nerfed with this latest 106 patch update, and I've done a little bit of testing to see how the gameplay stacks up. To start, the Bloodhound Step now has less travel distance and invincibility frames while also reducing the performance when used continuously. Although they did increase the travel distance for it with light equip loads, they also increased the rolling distance for players with light equip loads as well, so now you can easily stay right on top of anyone using Bloodhound Step just by rolling along with them. They also applied the same type of changes to the Quickstep Ash of War, so it performs about the same in how fast it can create distance overall, but they did also shorten the activation interval for using the skill in succession to make it easier to circle around enemies as well. But yeah, needless to say, with these nerfs, we should see a lot less people spamming these Ashes of War in PvP, so that's a win in my book. Now that we've covered Bloodhound Step though, let's move on to the next big change, the Rivers of Blood.
What's wrong with you, bro? What the heck? You tripping, bro. You tripping!
Finally, they have finally decreased the damage and bleed buildup from the Corpse Piler skill and did a slight decrease to the damage from the Rivers of Blood blade. Will this nerf be enough to prevent it from being the meta anymore? I'd like to think so, given how many other great weapons and builds there are. Will it be enough to convince people to stop using it so much? I hope so, but unfortunately it is still one of the easiest weapon skills to use, so it wouldn't surprise me if we still see people running it. But I'd like to think if we came across any Rivers of Blood users, they should be a lot easier to take care of now at least. Another big improvement they made for PvP is decreasing the target tracking ability of the Stars of Ruin spell. It is still a powerful spell overall since they didn't nerf the damage, so you could still use it for PvE, but thankfully we should see a lot less people spamming the spell in PvP, so multiplayer should be a good bit more of an enjoyable experience now that these changes have been implemented. Speaking of which, they also added an option to include distant areas when putting summoning signs down or trying to invade other players, so hopefully the matchmaking experience will be noticeably faster now for multiplayer too. One last major change they did was adding a new way to progress White Mask Vari's questline without having to participate in multiplayer invasions at all, and instead you can now complete it by defeating a new NPC. My wife Sovereign has actually already completed the questline with this new addition, so be sure to follow along if you're interested to see her covering it. Aside from that, numerous other balance changes have been implemented with this latest update, but one of the more notable ones in my opinion is for the Glintstone Pebble and the Glintstone Dart Ashes of War. Although they increased the projectile range of these attacks, they also decreased the damage and stagger power for both of them as well. So your stance should no longer be as easily broken when you come across either of these skills in PvP either, and from what I tested, I'd argue that the Glintstone Dart skill may be the better option to use between these two for PvE at least. Aside from that, there are multiple changes that have now been made to Greatswords, Curved Greatswords, and Great Hammers. This includes decreasing the time it takes to roll right after attacks and increasing the speed for guard counters and attack animations including strong and charged attacks. The one caveat here is that these buffs are excluded for jump attacks, mounted attacks, and dual-wielding attacks, so while you may want to consider using some of these weapons as your next go-to build, you may want to keep in mind the difference in attack speed and how long it takes to roll in between attacks while dual-wielding too. Regardless though, there are some great weapons to consider using more thanks to these buffs. Sovereign actually recently covered how fun it is to use the Envoy Longhorn with the large amount of poise damage it can do from its bubble attacks, and I've covered multiple greatswords as well, so be sure to check it out if you're curious. Speaking of builds to consider, one of my top recommendations would be for a build with dual-wielding the swords of St. Trina, now that the Mist of Slumber weapon skill has been fixed so that the sleep coating on the sword no longer goes away after receiving a hit from an enemy. This bug was the number one reason why I decided not to run this build initially, but now that it is fixed, you can bet I plan on trying it out. So if you're curious, feel free to subscribe to follow along since I do plan on covering this soon too. Another bigger bug fix they did was with the Rock Blaster spell. You used to be able to cast it without consuming any FP when using it with a staff on the left hand and no weapon on the right hand, but that is no longer the case, so don't expect to abuse this bug anymore. Another few patch notes to point out deals with areas that were not intended to be accessible by players, including for multiplayer. This piqued my curiosity since I know there are people that unfortunately abuse hiding in these inaccessible areas in PvP for AFK Rune farming. Although they may have fixed this issue in other areas, I was still able to access this area in Limgrave that I know is more commonly used for this too. So sadly, we may not be able to get rid of these issues with PvP quite yet. Likewise, there was a patch note stating that it fixed a bug that caused some areas to make the player unable to move, which led to death. I actually experienced this myself in my first YouTube short that I shared, so I figured I would test it out to see if I could get it to happen again. And lo and behold, the game decided to kill me again in the exact same spot. This doesn't mean they didn't fix this bug for other areas though, but it wouldn't surprise me if there are plenty more areas left that still cause this too. But at least it's a funny bug to experience if nothing else. Obviously there are plenty of other bug fixes that they did, so be sure to use the URL I provided in the description below to access the official patch notes if you are interested. I summarized and tested out what I thought were the most important changes they made, but feel free to comment below if you think there were any other important ones I may have overlooked, or if you think there are any other built-in weapons to consider trying out aside from the Sword of St. Trina now that these changes have been made. But as always, until next time, happy gaming!